We've done hundreds of videos on music production on this channel, but one thing that I've never really talked about is some of the most basic concepts of actually producing and making music. So we've done a ton of videos where we use things like EQ and compression and saturation and modulation and all of those really cool effects, but I realized that I've never actually done a deep dive on what those are. So I figured I would roll out a series where we kind of go over some of the basics, strip it back, and really show you what these different tools that you can use in your workflow are, how they work, how you can utilize them, what to kind of watch out for when you're using them. And the first one that I want to cover is EQ. So in this video, we're going to do a full deep dive on EQ. I'm going to show you how EQ works, what it actually is doing to your song or your sound. I'm going to show you things that you should watch out for when you are EQing. I'm going to show you what different types of EQ sound like and why one EQ might be the right choice and one EQ might do the exact opposite of what you really want it. And by the end of this video, you should have a much better understanding of EQ, how you can utilize it to actually sculpt your production or your music or different elements in your song. And you should understand kind of what you're looking for when you go to EQ something. So we're going to dive right in and take a look at all of that. But before we do, my name's Austin. You're watching Make Pop Music. We do tutorials like this every single Friday. So make sure you subscribe so you can stay up to date with all of the cool stuff that we release. Other than that, you can head over to our website, Make Pop Music. We have a ton of really, really cool stuff over there, including some free content and some paid stuff if you want to support the channel. That is going to be linked in the description below. But let's dive in. Also, if you like these videos and you want me to keep doing these videos on the basics, let me know. We can cover compression, saturation, reverb, delay, chorus, all kinds of really, really cool stuff. Let's take a look at EQ. So first, let's actually dive into what exactly EQ is. So I have a definition right here from iZotope. EQ, or equalization in music, is a process of adjusting the level or amplitude of specific frequencies to achieve a clear and balanced mix. So you've probably seen things like Pro Q where people are boosting and taking away. So there's a lot of cool things that you can do. You can obviously boost frequencies or you can subtract from them, also called attenuate on some different EQ plugins. And this is just a tool that you can use to really kind of shape your sound and sculpt what you want it to sound like. So if you have something that sounds a little bit muddy, you can take away some low end. If you have something that needs to be a little bit brighter, you can boost some top end. So I'm going to get into that a little bit more, but that is EQ in its most basic form. And the way that it works is it's typically applying those filters just to a certain frequency range, and that is giving you that perceived drop or that perceived increase in loudness. And when it does that, it's also shifting the phase. So when you do things like super, super, super heavy EQ moves, you are going to affect the phase rotation and the phase alignment of whatever you are actually working with. So just beware if you're starting to cut off tons of low end, you might be shifting your low end phase. If you start to do these massive 20 dB cuts, things start to, you know, slide around. It's not going to sound the same as adding something like a phaser or a chorus or a flanger. But if you EQ enough and you start adding enough of those different filters, you can end up getting something like a ring modulator or a comb filter or a phaser or flanger. So just keep in mind that when you are EQing, you are fundamentally changing what that sound is. It's not just that you are having something like a little volume knob that is taking away a certain frequency. It is much more complex than that. So we kind of talked about when you should use EQ already. So if you want to adjust certain frequencies or frequency ranges, but keep in mind that when you are working with EQ, something that you can kind of fall into is a little pitfall here. I'll show you in Pro Q. So if I'm working on this little key sound and I have Pro Q up, and let's say that I want to do something like boost low mids and boost highs. And let's say I'm cutting this. This is actually changing the volume quite a bit. So when you're using a lot of EQ, just make sure that once you, flip on and off, you kind of match this gain. It doesn't have to be super, super, super detailed, but make sure that when you're EQing, you're not just listening to the volume that it's either adding or removing. Because if we play this, it sounds a lot better because it's a lot louder, but let's just make sure that we're not hitting it too hard. So with the EQ, we have like -10, -11. Without the EQ, it's around -14 to -12. So we're doing about 2 extra dB of volume. So what you can do is you can always, on pretty much any EQ, adjust this output level. They'll also call it a trim knob. So when you do things like add this EQ, now let's flick it on and off, and there's not going to be a massive volume jump. So here's what it sounds like without and with. So you can get a much better understanding of what the EQ is actually boosting and taking away and changing, rather than it just being louder on the mix, so it kind of sits more on top. So especially when you're getting started EQing, make sure that you do your best to gain match. That way you can, carry this across any kind of effects, compression, saturation. You want to make sure that you are boosting perceived loudness and not necessarily eating up your headroom in terms of, boosting something on a fader. So just keep that in mind. That's something that a lot of people don't realize when they start EQing. It is going to massively affect the volume. Let's talk about some different types of EQs that you can use in your mix. So I want to start with just kind of general digital EQs. That's going to be similar to this Pro Q that you were using right here. It's going to be similar to something like frequency, which is just stock and Cubase. Every other basically DAW will have some kind of stock EQ, and they all typically work the same. They're digital, which means that they are not based on algorithms of like analog modeled EQs. So back in the day, before we had computers, everybody was using analog EQ. So think of like an SSL EQ or an API or a Neve or like a Maag EQ. And the way that those work is they actually send sound through capacitors and transistors, and that is affecting the sound. So they're going to sound drastically different, and they're going to have a much different tone than just something like this that is just kind of digitally adding or removing certain frequencies and kind of digitally shifting that phase. So if you're looking for a super, super clean EQ, you want to get really surgical, you know exactly what frequency you want to hit, digital EQ is probably going to be the way to go. So using something like Pro Q or frequency or, any of the kind of wave parametric EQs, which we'll talk about in a second. But if you want something super, super clean and you don't want a ton of extra character, digital EQ is going to be the way to go. However, just watch out, because if you're only using digital EQ, it can get a little bit sterile because, again, since it's only doing those really, really basic EQ curves, you're not going to be adding things like saturation or different kind of like bell curves that you're not seeing. So we'll talk about that right now. Let's go ahead and let's talk about some analog modeled EQs. So we have a couple right here in Slate Mix Rack, and a couple general ones that you're always going to hear are like an SSL EQ, an API EQ, a Neve EQ. You're also going to probably run into this one down here. This is called a Maag EQ. You're also probably going to run into a Pultec. And here's what the Pultec looks like. And what's interesting about all of these is that they are actually based on original EQ models. So these were analog units that then got modeled. So if you're using the hardware version, it's kind of the same thing that applies to if you're using a plugin modeled after that. But not only are these going to do those shapes like we were doing in Pro Q or frequency, but as the sound goes through these kind of impart a lot of different characteristics because they're not so perfect. They're not so based on just like a digital algorithm. So you're going to get things like saturation. They're all going to react to different frequency ranges a little bit differently because the cues are different on all of them all of the time. So I'll do a little shootout later where you can really hear the difference between an SSL, an API, a Neve, what it sounds like if we send it through Pro Q, what it sounds like if we send it through a Maag EQ. And you're quickly going to realize that doing a 4 dB boost at 7,000 kilohertz is not the same across every single EQ. So that's why it's really, really important to kind of learn some of the basic EQs, learn what they sound like, learn how you can utilize them, because if you understand what a SSL sounds like versus a Neve versus frequency, then you can really start to understand what you want to add in your mix and what you can pull away in your mix. Now that we've talked a little bit about analog versus digital, let's also dive into things like different types or formats of EQ. So the first one that I want to talk about is parametric EQ. That is probably the most common. And parametric EQ is basically an EQ or an equalizer that uses filters to adjust volumes of specific frequencies or ranges of frequencies within an audio signal. And so they look like this. They're adjustable. You can pick what frequency you want to do. You can pick how much you want to boost it or how much you want to remove it. And on a lot of these, you're going to have what is called the Q. So the Q is basically how wide or how narrow that booster cut is. So if I boost 5.75 dB at 341 and then I adjust that Q, that is going to be a much tighter sound where now it's only going to affect any frequencies within this range. If I broaden that, it's going to affect all of this. It's still a 5 dB boost at 340. However, you can really kind of pick how wide of a range versus how narrow of a range you want to respond to that EQ in terms of boosting or cutting. So, if you do something like this, let me show you what it sounds like with a synth. Let's make this 750. Let's do a 5 dB cut, and let's just show you what this sounds like as we shift this Q. So anything in that little green highlighted area, that is what's being affected. On a lot of digital EQs, you can also monitor. So if you start wanting to do things like really surgical cuts, you can tighten up that Q to, you know, let's say 9 or 10. You can sweep it to a specific frequency like this. Let's say we want to take out that 1585. We can just take out that one and it's not going to remove a ton of that high mid. And that's how you start to smooth out really, really harsh sounds. You can also do it with boosting, but typically with boosting, I try not to go super, super tight because it starts to add these weird kind of resonances. So unless you're trying to boost like a really specific frequency to sit above your mix, it's typically not going to be super flattering if you boost it at a really, really sharp Q. But that's the same on most parametric EQs. So even when you go into something like this SSL, this right here, that is going to be the Q. So you can see that over here is more narrow, over here is more wide, but you can see that we only go from 2.5 to 0.5. If we do that on Pro Q, we can go much wider, much sharper. So the SSL does have that. The Neve and the API typically do not. They're typically kind of a set Q, which is really why a lot of people love using them because they're more simple, so there's less things to dial in. So once you find your frequency and once you find out how much you want to boost it or take it away, these were designed by some of the best audio engineers in the world to really hit those frequencies perfectly. So if you're getting started on EQ and you don't want to kind of overanalyze or oversculpt your mix by doing these insane moves, maybe use something like this that doesn't have some of those Q options because that can keep you out of the weeds from like really, really surgically ruining your mix. And the last thing that I want to talk about on a parametric EQ is actually the different kind of curve styles or shapes. So you can see right here that there's a bunch of different shapes. I'll kind of show you some of them and I'll show you how to change these in an EQ and I'll show you kind of what they're doing. So you have something right here. These are called low cuts or high cuts or low pass / high pass. And these are basically going to remove anything that falls outside of that. So if you're trying to remove all of the low end, that's going to be what you do. So you can remove all of it, but that again will start to shift that phase. That's what I talked about earlier. So a lot of people really recommend instead of doing these really, really crazy low cuts, they'll do something called a low shelf. So let me show you that shape. It looks a little bit different. And instead, it's not going to do a harsh cutoff like that. It's essentially just going to slightly do this. And you can change the Q to be really sharp, really resonant, or really subtle. And this is basically just going to kind of create a gradual ramp down. So you're not getting that super crazy phase shift. You're not going to get that super, super hard cutoff. And you can obviously adjust the Q on these as well. So you can get really, really nitty gritty. Here is what is called a bell. This is probably the most common for most EQs. But again, you can kind of get nitty gritty with what you want that kind of Q to be. So we can dial this in. This is going to be your decibels per octave. So this is kind of going to give you that general shape. So let's say that you really want to attack everything from like 300 to like, I don't know, 800 specifically. Maybe you want to tighten that up because that's only going to hit those regions and you're not going to start to affect stuff down here, where if this was a smaller slope, as you can see, it's much more gradual. So when you're EQing, pay attention to what your kind of slope decibel per octave is, what your Q is, what shape are you using. Here's a notch, which is basically removing everything down to like 0 dB. Here is a high shelf. You can obviously boost it or attenuate it. You can do something like a high cut as well, which is basically the same thing as the low one. So there's a lot of different kind of moves that you can use within your EQ. So make sure that you learn your EQ plugins. Most stock DAWs will have a lot of EQs that have these same similar functions as Pro Q. I'm just using it because to me, it's the easiest to visually see and understand. And then as you get to some of these more analog styled ones, you have like your low filter here, you have a low filter over here, you have a high filter over here. So just kind of keep in mind where the filters are, where the Qs are, where the actual frequency selectors are, and then where the kind of gain selectors are. That's all you need to know with most EQs. Another style of EQ that you don't see a ton in terms of like music production and a computer, these are more used for live settings, is graphic EQs. So these have very, very specific set frequencies. You can't change the bell, you can't change the Q, you can't change the actual, like shape or style. It's essentially just gonna sit on whatever they've predetermined to be a really good sound, and you can boost it or you can take take it away. You see these a lot in like live settings, like I said. You can see them right here in like guitar settings. So the Corey Wong amp from Neural DSP, actually all of the Neural DSP stuff uses these. And that's because they basically just want to make sure that you're not over sculpting your sound. So they give you these frequency ranges that they think, okay, here's where you might want to boost or take away. And that's all the control you get. So if you're wanting to just do these really specific, but not overly clinical, overly kind of like analytical moves, maybe a graphic EQ is a cool one to try. I don't use them a ton in my kind of workflow, but they can be a cool alternative to like a parametric or a digital EQ if you want to just make sure that you're not going way too crazy with it. Let's talk about the next kind of EQ, and this is typically found on digital EQs, but there are a couple like analog models that have sidechain inputs where you can do this, but that is much more advanced than I want to get into in this video. And that is dynamic EQ. So ProQ has dynamic EQ, Frequency and Cubase has dynamic EQ. There's a lot that do it. I'm sure a lot of DAWs have stock EQs that will do dynamic. And the way that that works is typically if you boost an EQ or you cut it, like let's say we're doing 1486 at 4 dB, right? That's static. It's just always going to be boosting that frequency. Or cutting it. It's just kind of, it is there. Like it's never going to move, ever. But let's say that you have something where you like a lot of that region. There's just a couple notes here and there that really kind of hit it, and you don't want them to hit it so aggressively. What you can do is you can set this to a dynamic setting, and you have to make sure that your EQ plugins can do this. Not every single one can. So in ProQ or in Frequency, it's kind of the same. You'll just go to your EQ right here. You'll hit Make Dynamic, and then what I typically will do is I'll pull it back up, and then I'll tighten up that Q to wherever I want, and then this is where you can drag it down. So essentially what this is doing is it's setting a threshold. So once audio hits a certain level of this specific frequency range, it's going to let that EQ do whatever move you want, whether it's raise it or lower it. So this is a good way to make sure that you don't like murder all of your specific frequency range. I use this a lot on vocals for like top end. So I'll boost a lot of top end, but then I'll make it dynamic to make sure that as, you know, maybe they go up in the register, or maybe they hit something sibilant, or maybe there's just like a harsh word or phrase, it'll kind of close down on that. Or I'll use it on low mids to kind of scoop away some low mids whenever they kind of get lower in their voice, but it's not just suffocating the low mids and scooping them out completely. It's a really cool way to get really nitty gritty with EQ, and it almost works like a compressor. However, you're not compressing it. You're simply just adding that EQ filter whenever it's needed. So you can see right here, it's only doing it at the very beginning where there's that transient of that pluck, because that's all that it needs. You can set this threshold right here. I have it on auto, but you can always change it. So now it's squeezing that frequency a little bit more. If you boost it up here, nothing at all. Now it's just doing that transient again. This is a really cool way to not overly sculpt your EQs and like completely suck the life out of like a vocal or a guitar or a drum. Maybe you just want to tighten them up when there's like one or two notes or phrases or weird sections. And that's what dynamic EQ will do. So if you haven't been using dynamic EQ, it's a really, really, really great tool. Just make sure that you kind of take your time to dial in your threshold and hit it on the specific parts where you want it to hit. Otherwise, it's just going to act as a static EQ if it's doing this. The next EQ that I want to talk about is one called mid-side. So this has to be on a stereo source. So right now I'm using a stereo key. And what you can do is mid-side basically allows you to either boost or attenuate the midsection of the stereo field or the sides of the stereo field independently. So rather than just doing a big, let's say like a big 2.7K boost right here, let's say we just want that to happen on the side. So I can go to stereo placement, I can select sides, and now it's only going to boost that on the side. So if I have a vocal that's right in the middle that needs to sit in, you know, this frequency, let's say that I want to hit mids, and let's say I want to scoop some of this. And this is going to allow right around 1600 hertz to really be taken away from the middle. Or we boost it. One thing that you have to be really careful though with mid-side EQ is that you can really start to affect your stereo field, and it might start to ruin mono compatibility eventually. So I try to use this a little bit subtly. I use this on a lot of like buses and stuff at the end. So one of my favorite tricks is I'll turn a high shelf to sides, and I'll just boost everything above like, I don't know, maybe 8K by a couple dB. And that will typically brighten everything up on the sides, make the synth a bit wider, a bit more sparkly, a bit more ambient. But then it's not going to completely just make everything super bright and shrill. Let's say we want to boost this on the side so it can kind of thicken up the stereo field. A lot of people will do this with low end, so let's say they'll go to like 96 dB. And if you're doing this, I highly suggest swapping this to linear phase. And then what they'll do is they'll drag this up to, I don't know, 100 hertz. And this is basically going to remove all the low end from the sides. You could drag it up as far as you want. But mid-side EQ basically allows you to EQ the sides of the stereo field and the middle of the stereo field separately, so you can really get some of that extra stereo separation. Just make sure that you don't overuse it, because you could actually end up kind of just completely obliviating your sound. The last little function of EQ that I want to talk about is one that is similar to mid-side, but instead it's just left-right EQ. So you could basically just, you know, do the same thing as mid-side, but you could just boost the left side, and then you could boost the right side. And a lot of people will do this on things like guitars or background vocals, because what this is going to do is it kind of gives the left a certain frequency and the right a certain frequency. And typically people get perceived stereo width when the left and the right sound slightly different. If everything sounds the same on the left and the right, they'll start to phase out. It's not going to sound super, super wide. So a lot of people will use like split EQ for the left and right to really make sure that the left maybe has a little bit more mid in a certain section, the right has a little bit more top end in a certain section. And it's a really cool way to kind of rebalance the stereo field. A lot of people also use this in mastering. So once they get to the end and they realize, oh, they had the left guitar a lot brighter, so that it's a lot brighter on the left, they'll just do a little, you know, they'll do a little scoop right here, and they'll make sure that that's only affecting the left, so they're not completely ruining the entire, you know, 2K or whatever. So it's a really, really cool way to kind of independently do everything. It's basically like a dual mono mixing trick. So think you can treat the left separately, you can treat the right separately, and you can get super aggressive. Like, let's way overanalyze this so it kind of just sounds insane. But hear how much wider it got, and that's because it's completely changing your perspective of the left and the right stereo field. So now on the right, it's a little bit brighter, and the left, it's a little bit more mid-heavy and thicker, and to your ears, they're discerning that. The last thing that I want to talk about before I do a quick little shootout of different EQs to show you how differently they are is just talk about some of the different frequency ranges, right? So you're going to hear people talk about things like sub or mids or low mids or high mids. So let's go over that real quick. For me, subs is going to be typically anything up to about 70 to 80 hertz. So this is going to be anything that ends up coming through a subwoofer. Sometimes this will even go up to 100. And then when I think of low end, I'm typically thinking of like 80 to maybe like 160 to 180. So if I hear somebody say it needs less low end, I'm going to specifically ask, do you mean like less sub information, or do you mean less around that kind of 100 to 160 range? Because they're really, really drastically different, and they hit speakers very, very differently, especially if somebody's using a three-way system with a subwoofer, a mid-woofer, and a tweeter. So sub, I typically will say anything below like 70, maybe 75. And then low end, I'm thinking that like 80 to kind of 160, 180. And that's typically those regions. Then you get into what I like to call low mids, and that's typically like my 200 to kind of 350. This is where I find things either have a ton of body or they get kind of like muddy. So there's not a lot of low information on this. Let me go to something that has a little bit more. Like, let me go to a bass and I'll show you what I mean. So here's a bass that I have, and let me show you what it sounds like if I boost subs versus lows versus low mids. That's kind of subby. That's kind of lows. This doesn't have a ton of sub information. So if I were EQing this, I would really focus on this low section right here. So between like 80 and 160. Then when I get into low mids, So this might be a section where I say, okay, it's a little bit loose, it's a little bit muddy, it's a little bit kind of muffled. The low mids is typically going to be the first that I attack. Then we move on to the mids. I'm thinking mids are going to be anywhere between like maybe 400 hertz and like 2K. This is really where I think most of the frequency range will lie with like human hearing, especially on smaller speakers or crappy headphones. So anywhere between like 500 and 2K, that is going to typically for everything except for like a kick drum, a bass, or like a really, really, really high synth or something. This is going to be the area that you probably want to make sure is hitting the best. This is also the area where if things sound boxy or they sound lifeless or they sound dull, you can start to scoop them away. So if it sounds kind of boxy, take a little bit out. If it sounds stale and lifeless, now it's a little bit tighter in that kind of like mid right here around 500. It's a little bit more kind of bitey in this mid up here around 800. And that's typically the mid section. Then you move on to high mids. I think high mids are anywhere between like maybe like 1.8K and like 4K to me. These are going to be where things either really punch through a mix and they're really, really prominent and in your face, or they get really shrill, they get really aggressive, they get really like sibilant for a vocal. This is that range that I watch for. Let me go on to a better example because it's just a bass. It's not going to sound that different. Let me go to something like a hard brass, and I'll show you how this high mid section can either be really beautiful or really abrasive. This is where a lot of people will start to like really take out areas like 2K, 4K, 5K, and it can be a great way to kind of smooth the sound out. So let's do this. So you can see that we got rid of a little bit of that weird kind of resonant ringing, but in the mix, it's also going to be less audible because this kind of region is really what makes things pop to the front of the mix in terms of presence. You can also then, what I like to do is if I do a big cut like that, I'll try to maybe boost something around it to kind of just bring up the volume of maybe the high mids in general and then just really sculpt out what I don't like. And high mids are really where you're going to want to make sure that things pop forward in the mix. You don't overly sculpt them, but you also want to make sure that they're not bright and really ringy and really sibilant and really kind of abrasive. This is typically the region that plugins like Soothe or Smooth Operator will kind of operate in, is that high mid frequency between like, again, like 2K and 4K, 5K. Then you go on to like high end or treble. I'm thinking that's anywhere between like 5K and 10K. This is where things really have bite and really have snap, but they can also get really kind of weird and sizzly and like super kind of saturated sounding. Like that almost just sounds like digital buzz. But if you take it away, it loses all of its presence. So again, make sure that you're not kind of ruining your top end. And then I think of things like air anywhere above like 12K. And this is where you're starting to almost get into where humans can't even hear above 15K, 16K, maybe even 18K if you have amazing ears. But what's really cool is that this will still change the sound. So even if I boost over here at 30K, which no humans can hear, it's still going to impart a sound because it's not only working on 30K, it's working its way down, and it's just going to change the actual relationship of the entire sound, even beyond things that you can't hear. So if you're on good monitors, you can still hear that, but you're not hearing 30K. You're probably hearing more like 15K, 14K. So when you hear a lot of people talk about adding air to vocals, they'll add, 20K, 25K, because what that's doing is that's allowing them to boost above where humans can hear, but then it has that really nice kind of gradual roll off at the top of our hearing, which is going to add that air, add that silk, add that really, really nice sheen and presence, but it's not going to make them super abrasive, super aggressive, super bright, super sibilant. So those are the frequency ranges that you should watch out for. Now, I want to do one last thing before we end this video, and that is actually shoot out a couple different EQs. So we have a virtual mix rack right here with a SSL, an API, and a Neve EQ. We have FabFilter Pro Q right here, and we have a Pultec. This is Waves Puig Tech, and we have a Maag EQ, which is like my favorite for like adding air or bus processing. So we're not going to be able to match these Pultec and Maag EQs because they don't have a lot of the same frequency ranges or the same settings, but I want to show you how those work because they are common formats for EQ outside of your typical kind of console EQs or digital EQs. So let's go ahead and close all of these, and I'm going to start just with virtual mix rack. If you see the yellow over here, that means that that is the one that is active. So right now we're going to start with nothing, and then I'm going to go EQ by EQ and show you that I've dialed these settings in to be as exact as possible. But again, every EQ is different. The SSL was made differently than the API, which was made differently than the Neve. And you're going to see how drastic that has an effect on the sound. So even though we're doing the same 7K 4 dB boost and the same 800 Hertz 2 dB boost and the same 200 Hertz 4 dB dip, they sound so different it's not even funny. So let's start with no EQ and then SSL. So before I dive into the other two that we can't really do a one-for-one comparison, let's just talk about what I heard, and I would be keen to hear what you heard, so let me know in the comments down below. But I found that with the SSL was the only kind of analog style EQ that to me still maintained a lot of the kind of low mids, especially around that like 400 to 500 Hertz region. And when I boosted the top end, to me, this was still really nice and kind of silky, and it sounded really, really smooth. So let me show you again. But then when we move on to something like the API, this to me is taking away so much more low end, it's not even funny. So we're still doing the same 4 dB reduction at 200 Hertz, but to me, this one is just taking away so much more than that. And when I boost this 7K, it is a lot more kind of high, mid, heavy. So to me, this would be great on something like a snare drum or maybe like a rock guitar, something where you really want to push those mids, because I feel like it's saturating the mids a lot more than that SSL EQ. Let me show you. To me, it's really thinning the sound out. So if you want something where you're going to take away a lot of that body, but you're really going to add some aggressive high mids, maybe the API is going to be what you go for. Let's take a listen to the Neve. I find this to kind of be in the middle. So I find the top end a little bit more silky than the API, not quite as silky as the SSL, but I love a Neve for vocals because this kind of British style EQ can be a really good way to add some top presence into your vocal without it getting super sibilant and super aggressive. Let's hear that versus this API. To me, it's still maintaining some of the mids a little bit better, so it keeps the relationship on something like a vocal a little bit more balanced, where this API on a vocal to me is probably going to get really abrasive. I don't know if I would go for that. I'd probably either go for the SSL if I want something super smooth, or the Neve if I want something a little bit more aggressive and bitey. And then just to show you how different, this is me doing the exact same Qs and dips and boosts as that SSL EQ, but since it's not analog, it's not going to have the same kind of saturation, it's not going to have the same kind of characteristics, it's not nearly as gain dependent, so a lot of those analog modeled EQs are super dependent on how loud or soft the signal is when you send them in, where Pro Q, it's just doing the boost that I'm telling it to. So you can hear how much more precise and surgical something like that is versus something like this. Even though we're technically doing the same exact EQ boosts and dips in the same exact region, roughly, but they sound drastically different. Now, let's move on to our last couple EQs that I want to talk about just because you're going to see them everywhere. So you have something like a Pultec. This looks completely different, but essentially you have boost and you have attenuate. And like I said earlier, attenuate also means to reduce. So if you drag this attenuation up, you can think of that as pulling something down. So depending on which Pultec style EQ you download, they're probably going to have different frequency ranges. But over here, this is really, really great to boost low end and boost really top end and kind of attenuate some mids. But it's not my first choice if I'm really trying to get precise. I think of a Pultec more as like a sweetener EQ. So we can boost low end up to 100 hertz. That attenuation is going to take out some of those low mids. So I love doing this on something like a vocal where I want to add some boost to the low end and really give them some body. And then I can attenuate some of those kind of chesty, tubby low mids. And then same with the top end. I love boosting like right above 10K, 12K, and then attenuating some of that like 5 to 8K. So using something like a Pultec, even though it doesn't have as many parameters that you can really customize, is a cool way to kind of just add a little bit of that extra finishing salt on whatever you're mixing. So that EQ to me, really, really great for finishing up. Same thing kind of with this Maag EQ. I just want to mention this one. It's not nearly as popular, but to me, this is a set parametric EQ. So it's only going to hit 160 hertz, 600 hertz, 2.5K, and then you have an adjustable top end air. So I love this for vocals because 650 is normally an area that I want to kind of handle. 2K is where vocals for me get kind of bright and sibilant. So sometimes I'll bring those down. And then you have your air over here that you can really boost. And to me, this is like the silkiest air ever. So a lot of the time I'll hit this at 10 or 20 on things like cymbals or vocals or the top end of a synth. And this allows me to get something super bright and super airy, but not super, sibilant and harsh. And you can hear that all of these analog style EQs, whether it's the Pultec or the Maag or the SSL or the API or the Neve, they all have really different parameters and they all have really, really, really different sounds. And that is why you might want to consider, do you want to go for a digital EQ? Do you want to go for an analog style EQ? Do you want to go for an SSL or do you want to go for a Neve? Are you trying to get a really, really tight, narrow Q or do you want something broad and sweeping? Are you trying to get something that has adjustable frequencies or do you want something that is just kind of set it and forget it? So those are all things that I think you need to be keeping in mind when you're looking at EQ. There are so many more things that I could talk about. So if you have any questions about EQ, let me know in the comments down below. I'm going to be answering anything that I possibly can. If you want to see more videos like this where we talk about compressors or saturation or modulation or reverb or delay or any of the other kind of really basic fundamental things that you're going to use in recording or producing or mixing, let me know. I can do entire videos where we do deep dives on that. But hopefully you enjoyed this. If you did, make sure you leave a like. Make sure that you subscribe to the channel. Share this video with a friend who needs to learn how to EQ their stuff correctly. And then other than that, we're going to be back next week with more content and I'll see you soon. But until then, much love. Peace.